Grace stood in the snow watching the last flames consume her barn. Everything she owned gone. The smell of burning hay mixed with something worse. Her cattle. Then she saw the kerosene tin. This was no accident. Before she could even process the devastation, 5 riders appeared on the street. Nathaniel Breckenridge dismounted with a cold smile. "Mrs. Ashford, I heard about your unfortunate fire." He pulled out a document. "Your loan is now due immediately. You have 24 hours to pay $180, or I take your land tomorrow." Grace's world tilted. No money, no barn, no way out. Breckenridge leaned in. "Unless you'd like to accept my offer, $200, cash, today." She drew herself up, voice steady despite the terror. "My answer is no." "Then I'll see you tomorrow, Mrs. Ashford, when your land becomes mine." The morning sky hung low and gray over Wyoming, heavy with the promise of snow that would not come for hours yet. The kind of cold that made breath visible, that turned the prairie into an endless stretch of white, interrupted only by fence posts and the occasional stunted tree. The kind of cold that killed. James Crawford had ridden fence line for 20 years, ever since his father first put him on a horse at age 14 before the war, before Catherine, before he learned that some winters lasted far longer than a season. Now at 34, with shoulders broad from labor and a scar running down his left cheek from a Confederate saber, he rode the northwestern boundary of his ranch with the practiced efficiency of a man for whom routine was refuge. His horse, a gray gelding named Smoke, picked its way along the fence with careful precision. The ground beneath them was frozen solid, had been for 6 weeks straight. Nothing short of dynamite would break it now. Jamie knew this the way a man knows the texture of his own calluses, intimate and unthinking. His mind occupied itself with the ordinary calculations of survival. Cattle count 143 head down, 2 from last week. Hay stores sufficient through March if the weather held. Calving season 6 weeks out, preparations needed. Tommy's schoolwork falling behind in arithmetic needed attention. The list was familiar, comforting in its predictability. Jamie had built his life on such lists, on tasks that could be completed, and checked off problems with solutions that did not require examining the hollow space where his heart used to be. Then he saw her. A small dark figure in the valley below, in the cemetery that served the scattered homesteads and ranches of the territory. Even from 400 yards away, even with the glare of sun on snow half blinding him, Jamie could see the futility of what she was attempting. The woman wore black, full morning dress, impractical for work, already soaked through at the hem from kneeling in snow. She was swinging something. A shovel, bringing it down again and again against ground that would not yield, that could not yield, that had been frozen into something more stone than soil. And beside her, resting in the snow with the patience of the dead, a small pine coffin. Jamie reined in Smoke. The gelding snorted, breath steaming. For a long moment Jamie simply sat there, looking down into the valley, and something in his chest that had been frozen for 16 years began very slowly to crack. He had seen this before, had lived this before. Same cemetery, same frozen ground, different woman, different coffin. Catherine dead at 22, their son who never drew breath. The memory rose sharp and immediate. The Presbyterian minister's voice thin in the winter wind. His father and 2 hired hands taking turns with the shovel, the work brutal and slow. Jamie himself standing useless, his hands wrapped in bandages because he had torn them bloody, trying to dig the grave himself the night before, alone weeping, refusing to believe that effort and will could not somehow undo what had been done. The woman below swung the shovel again. The impact rang out across the valley metal on ice, and Jamie saw her stagger from the shock of it traveling up the handle into her shoulders. She caught herself, raised the shovel again. He touched his heels to Smoke's flanks and started down the slope. As he drew closer, recognition came. Grace Ashford, the widow who had claimed the hardscrabble 160 acres 2 miles east last autumn after her husband died in a logging accident. Jamie had seen her in town perhaps 3 times, always alone, always with that particular quality of determination that came from having no choice but to be strong. She was younger than he had thought. Mid-20s perhaps, though grief had aged her, had carved lines around her eyes and mouth that should not have been there for another 20 years. Small-boned, maybe 5'4", with dark hair pulled back severely and a face pale enough to suggest she had not eaten properly in some time. The wind was fierce in the valley, howling across the open ground with nothing to stop it. It carried sound away, which was why she did not hear Jamie's approach. She was entirely focused on the ground before her, on the impossible task she had set herself. Jamie dismounted slowly, quietly, 30 yards out. Led Smoke the rest of the way on foot. Close enough now to see the dark circles under her eyes. Close enough to see that she had been crying, that the tears had frozen on her cheeks in thin tracks of ice. Close enough to see the small coffin clearly. It was homemade. Rough pine boards carefully fitted and sanded smooth, lined with what looked like white linen, built with care by someone who had never built such a thing before and prayed they would never have to again. Grace swung the shovel. The blade rang against the frozen earth. She staggered, caught herself with visible effort, drew breath, her whole body shaking with cold or exhaustion, or both, raised the shovel for another attempt. "Ma'am," Jamie said quietly. She spun, and the shovel came up like a weapon, and for a moment they stood frozen in tableau. The widow, with her makeshift arms, the stranger on foot hands carefully visible and empty. Between them, the small coffin and the unbroken ground. Her face was gray with exhaustion and cold, but her eyes, even hollow with grief, held something that Jamie recognized from his own mirror. That refusal to surrender. That stubborn insistence on dignity, even when dignity seemed absurd. "I don't need help," she said. Her voice was breaking threads of it, fraying into something close to desperation, but the words themselves were firm. Jamie looked at the coffin, looked at the frozen earth unmarked except for the dozens of shallow scrapes where the shovel had failed to penetrate, looked at her hands trembling even as they gripped the wooden handle. He thought about speaking, about offering condolences or explanations or any of the useless words people said in the face of death. He had heard them all 16 years ago, had hated every one of them. Instead, he stepped forward and gently took the shovel from her grip. "Let me," he said. For a moment he thought she would fight. Her hands tightened on the handle, her jaw set. But then something in her seemed to collapse inward, and her hands fell to her sides, and she sank to her knees beside the coffin, one hand coming to rest on its rough pine surface. Jamie positioned himself, set his weight, and drove the shovel down with all the strength 20 years of ranch work had built into his shoulders and back. The ground resisted. Then, with a sound like breaking glass, it gave slightly, perhaps an inch, perhaps less. Jamie worked the blade, levering, loosening a chunk of frozen dirt the size of his fist. It took 2 minutes of steady effort. This was going to take hours. He set his jaw and kept digging. The only sounds were the shovel striking earth, his breathing growing heavier with effort, and the wind moving through the bare branches of a cottonwood tree at the cemetery's edge. The woman knelt motionless, her hand on the coffin, her lips moving in words he could not hear and did not need to. Jamie had dug graves before. In the war, too many to count, shallow holes scraped into red Virginia clay for boys who would never go home. After the war, for ranch hands killed in accidents, for neighbors taken by disease, for his father who died too young from a heart that simply stopped. And for Catherine, for the wife he had loved and the son he never met. He knew the weight of this work. Knew the way it settled into your shoulders and stayed there aching long after the physical effort ended. An hour passed, maybe more. Time moved strangely in cold like this, in grief like this. Jamie's shoulders burned. Sweat froze on his neck despite the temperature. He had cleared perhaps 18 inches of depth, maybe 2 feet in diameter. The hole looked impossibly small. The work looked impossibly far from done. The sound of approaching horses made him look up. 2 riders came over the ridge to the east. Sam Porter and Bill Hayes, his hired hands. They must have realized he had been gone too long come looking. Now they took in the scene with the quick comprehension of men who had seen enough of life to understand immediately what they were witnessing. Sam, 42 years old and steady as stone, dismounted without a word. He walked to his saddle and pulled out a pickaxe that he had brought for fence work. Bill, grizzled and gray at 64, joined him. Together the three men worked, taking turns with shovel and pick, attacking the frozen ground with systematic determination. No one spoke. There was nothing to say that the work itself did not express more clearly. They were digging a grave for a child they had never known, standing witness for a woman who had no one else, doing the only thing that mattered in this moment, which was making sure that the small body in the small coffin would have a resting place that met the frozen ground with something other than futility. The hole deepened, 2 feet, 2.5, 3 feet. Deep enough. It would have to be. Sam stepped back first, removing his hat. Bill and Jamie did the same. Their breath steamed in the cold air. Their hands were raw despite gloves, but the grave was ready. Grace stood on legs that trembled visibly. She bent and lifted the coffin. It was light, horribly, impossibly light. Whatever child lay within weighed almost nothing. Jamie moved to help, but Grace shook her head. She needed to do this part herself. He understood. Some burdens could not be shared. She knelt at the grave's edge, her black dress spreading in the snow around her like ink in water. With shaking arms, she lowered the coffin into the earth. It settled with a soft sound that seemed too quiet for something so final. Grace stayed kneeling, staring down. Her lips moved again, soundless prayers, or perhaps just the child's name spoken one last time. Jamie reached into his coat and pulled out the worn Bible he always carried, a habit from childhood reinforced by war, maintained through the long years after. He was not sure he believed anymore in the God these pages described, but he believed in the words themselves, in their power to shape chaos into something bearable. His hands were stiff with cold as he opened to Isaiah. The pages were familiar, creased from use. "Ma'am," he said gently, "if you'd permit me." Grace looked up at him with eyes that seemed to have seen through to the other side of sorrow and found nothing there. She nodded once. Jamie's voice was steady as he read, "He shall feed his flock like a shepherd. He shall gather the lambs with his arm and carry them in his bosom." The words from Isaiah felt inadequate, felt like every word always felt in the face of death, small and fragile against the enormity of absence. But they were all he had, all anyone had, these promises of comfort and care in some distant heaven, while the frozen earth waited to receive its own. He continued reading verses about children and mercy and the Lord's tender keeping. His voice was the only sound besides the wind, which seemed to grow quieter as he spoke, or perhaps he simply stopped hearing it. Grace's shoulders began to shake. Then the sobs came, wrenching sounds torn from somewhere deep, the kind of grief that could not be contained or controlled. Jamie kept reading. "The Lord is nigh unto them that are of a broken heart, and saveth such as be of a contrite spirit." When he finished, he closed the Bible carefully and slipped it back inside his coat. The silence that followed felt sacred, somehow weighted with things beyond language. Jamie nodded to Sam and Bill. Together they began filling the grave, working gently, respectfully, placing the frozen chunks of earth as carefully as if they were laying stones for a foundation. Each piece mattered. Each piece was part of making this real, this final. Sam found 2 sturdy pine branches and lashed them together with leather cord from his saddle, forming a simple cross. The work took only minutes, but he performed it with the same care he would give to any task worth doing. The mound of earth grew. Jamie patted it smooth with the back of the shovel, shaping it into something that looked intentional rather than merely abandoned. Sam placed the cross at its head, driving it deep enough to withstand the Wyoming wind that could howl for days without ceasing. "She'll need a proper stone come spring," Bill said quietly to Jamie, his voice rough with cold and perhaps something else. "I'll carve one," Jamie replied. Grace had not moved. She stood beside the grave, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the fresh-turned earth that was already beginning to freeze again in the brutal cold. The sun was dropping toward the western horizon. the light taking on that peculiar quality it had in winter, sharp and thin, and somehow more distant than in summer. Temperature would plummet once darkness fell. 20 below, maybe 30. Deadly cold for anyone caught outside. Jamie glanced at Sam and Bill. They understood without words the way men who had worked together for years could communicate entire conversations in a look. "We'll head back to the ranch," Sam said, touching his hat brim toward Grace. "Ma'am, you have our sympathies." Bill nodded his agreement, started to speak, stopped, nodded again. Sometimes there were no words. They mounted and rode off, leaving Jamie alone with the widow. But not quite alone. Even as Sam and Bill disappeared over the ridge, another rider appeared from the opposite direction, coming from town at an easy pace. Nathaniel Breckenridge sat tall in his saddle, dressed in clothes too fine for riding in winter, a man who wanted everyone to know he could afford to be impractical. 48 years old, owner of the only bank in the county, holder of mortgages on half the homesteads in the valley. He had the smooth face of a man who did not do physical labor, and the cold eyes of a man who saw other people primarily as opportunities. He reined in his horse at a respectful distance from the grave, but not far enough to suggest he was merely passing by. This was deliberate. He had come here with purpose. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, his voice carrying across the cemetery with the practiced projection of a man accustomed to being heard, "my deepest condolences for your loss." Grace turned slowly to face him. Her expression was blank, exhausted past the point where social niceties had any meaning. "Mr. Breckenridge," she said. Her voice was flat. "A terrible tragedy. A child is always the hardest." He paused, managing to make even silence feel calculated. "When you've had time to recover from your grief, we'll need to discuss your outstanding loan. The payment is due March 1st. That's 7 weeks from now. $180 remaining." Jamie felt something cold settle in his gut. The timing of this was not accidental. The location was not accidental. Breckenridge had known she would be here, had chosen this moment deliberately. "I understand," Grace said. Her voice held no inflection at all. Breckenridge inclined his head, touched his hat brim with false courtesy, and turned his horse away. He rode north toward town, his back straight, his pace unhurried. A man with all the time in the world because he owned most of it. Jamie watched him go, memorizing the set of those shoulders, the particular angle of that hat, storing it away for future reference. War had taught him that some men were enemies whether you wanted them to be or not. He turned back to Grace. She was staring at the grave again, as if the brief interruption had not happened, as if nothing existed beyond this small mound of earth and what lay beneath it. "Where's your place?" Jamie asked quietly. 2 miles east. I'll follow you home. Make sure you get there safe." For a moment, he thought she would refuse. Pride seemed to war with exhaustion on her face. Then she simply nodded and walked to her horse tied to the cemetery fence. She mounted stiffly, moving like someone much older than her years, someone whose body had forgotten how to perform even simple tasks without conscious effort. Jamie swung onto Smoke and followed as she rode out of the cemetery. He kept his distance, not crowding her, giving her what privacy could be given when trailing someone across open prairie. The sun was setting behind them now, painting the snow orange and pink in that brief window when winter could look almost beautiful. Grace rode with her back straight, but Jamie could see her shoulders shake with silent sobs that she thought no one could see. Her cabin came into view as they crested the last rise. Small one room with a loft tucked against a hillside for wind protection. Smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting she had left a fire burning when she departed that morning for the cemetery. The barn beside it was modest but well maintained, or had been. Jamie could see from here that the door was hanging crooked, one hinge broken. Grace dismounted and went inside without looking back. A moment later, lamplight appeared in the window, warm and yellow against the gathering dark. Jamie waited until he was certain she was safe inside, that the door was properly shut against the cold, that smoke continued rising from the chimney. Then he turned Smoke toward home, toward his own ranch, 4 miles northwest, toward the life that waited for him there. Inside her cabin, Grace sat at the rough pine table without removing her coat. Her hands lay flat on the wood, palms down. She could not feel them, could not feel anything except the vast emptiness that had opened up inside her chest where Emma used to live. 3 days ago her daughter had been alive, feverish, struggling to breathe, but alive. Grace had ridden 8 miles through darkness to fetch Dr. Morrison from town. Emma wrapped in blankets and burning hot against her chest, and the doctor had followed her back, but by the time they arrived, Emma's breathing had changed. By dawn, she was gone. The doctor had been kind. He had helped Grace wash her daughter's tiny body, had wrapped her in clean linen, had promised to send word to neighbors. But no one had come. It was January, the hardest month. Everyone was dealing with their own struggles, their own stock to feed their own challenges with this brutal winter. Grace had understood. She had always understood. When her husband Robert died under a fallen timber 14 months ago, neighbors had helped at first. They had brought food, offered assistance. But frontier kindness had limits. People had their own lives, their own troubles. Eventually, everyone drifted back to their own concerns, and Grace was alone again. She had learned to manage, had taught herself to handle Robert's work, feeding cattle, mending fence, hauling water from the creek, even when it meant breaking ice 2 inches thick. She had been proud of her independence. When she discovered she was carrying Robert's child, she had been terrified and grateful in equal measure. A piece of him still alive, still present. Emma had been born in May, delivered by a midwife from the neighboring claim who stayed 2 days, then left. Grace and Emma alone together. It had been enough. More than enough. The baby's weight in her arms, the sound of her breathing at night, the way she would grip Grace's finger with surprising strength. Until 3 nights ago when the fever came sudden and burned so hot. Grace had built the coffin herself yesterday, measuring carefully using pine boards Robert had saved for building a crib. The irony was not lost on her. She had lined it with fabric from her wedding dress, white linen carefully cut and sewn. Emma deserved something beautiful. This morning she had loaded the coffin onto her wagon and driven to the cemetery, unloaded it herself, picked up the shovel with grim determination, fully intending to dig the grave alone. But the ground had defeated her. After 2 hours of futile effort, her arms shaking, her hands blistered, she had made almost no progress. Then he had appeared. James Crawford. She knew his name from town, knew he ran one of the larger ranches in the territory, had a reputation for fair dealing and quiet competence. He had taken the shovel without hesitation, had not asked questions or offered empty platitudes, had simply dug. When his men arrived, they had dug too. 3 strangers working in the cold to help her bury her daughter. The kindness of it broke something inside her that all the grief had not managed to touch. All the fierce independence she had cultivated, all the walls she had built to survive alone, they crumbled in the face of simple human compassion, freely given with no expectation of return. Grace finally moved, pulling off her coat with hands that barely functioned. She added wood to the stove and stood close to it, trying to thaw. But the cold she felt was not the kind that heat could touch. Tomorrow she would wake up, and Emma would still be gone. The day after that, the same. An endless succession of days without her daughter. She thought about the rancher reading from his Bible, the steadiness of his voice, the way he had stayed until the grave was filled and marked, the way he had followed her home to ensure she arrived safely. Maybe surviving alone was not the same as living. Maybe there was another way. But tonight she was too tired to think about it. Tonight she could only sit by the stove and let the tears come hot against her frozen cheeks, falling onto the rough wood of the table that Robert had built with his own hands in the first month of their marriage, back when the future had seemed full of possibility instead of absence. Outside the temperature dropped. The stars came out brilliant and cold and infinitely distant. The wind began to rise again, moaning around the corners of the cabin. And somewhere in the darkness a coyote called lonely and persistent, answered by another far away. Jamie rode through the gathering night with smoke's steady rhythm beneath him and his thoughts circling like crows around carrion. The image of Grace kneeling beside that small coffin would not leave him. kept overlaying with the image of himself 16 years ago, kneeling beside Catherine's grave in this same cemetery, in this same frozen ground. He had been 18 when he enlisted. Young and stupid and full of the kind of certainty that evaporates the first time you see a man die badly. He had fought for 4 years, learned to kill efficiently, learned to sleep through artillery, learned that courage and cowardice were often indistinguishable in the moment. He came home at 22 to find his father struggling with the ranch, his mother dead from influenza, and Catherine Miller still waiting for him. They had been promised to each other since childhood, a match arranged by their families, but blessed by genuine affection. She was beautiful and kind and patient with his nightmares. They married within a month of his return. She was pregnant within 2. Everything should have been perfect. The complications started early. The midwife had warned them, but what could they do? Stop the pregnancy? Impossible. So they waited and hoped and prayed, and when Catherine's time came, the labor lasted 2 days. Jamie paced outside the bedroom door, listening to her scream, helpless, in a way that war had never made him feel helpless. When the midwife finally emerged, her face told him everything before her words did. Catherine had bled too much. The baby, a boy, had never breathed. They were both gone within an hour of each other. Jamie had buried them together, Catherine holding their son in her arms for eternity, and something in him had frozen solid that day. For 16 years he had kept that ice intact, had built his life around it, had told himself that he was content with work and solitude and the kind of surface pleasures that required no emotional risk. Now, riding through winter dark, with the image of another woman's grief fresh in his mind, he felt that ice beginning to crack, and it terrified him. His ranch appeared over the final rise. Larger than Grace's homestead, the product of 3 generations of Crawford labor. The main house was solid timber, 2 stories built by his grandfather in 1852. The bunkhouse where Sam and Bill slept. The barn that could hold 30 horses comfortably. The corrals and sheds and all the infrastructure of a working cattle operation. Lamplight showed in the main house window. Tommy would be waiting probably at the table with his schoolwork spread out trying to focus despite being hungry for supper. Jamie stabled. Smoke brushed him down despite his own exhaustion, made sure the gelding had feed and water. The work was automatic soothing in its familiarity. Inside the house warmth hit him like a wall. Tommy looked up from his arithmetic problems, 7 years old, with dark hair like Jamie's and gray eyes that were too serious for his age. "Uncle Jamie," the boy said. "You were gone a long time." "I was. Sorry for keeping supper waiting." "I already ate. There's stew on the stove." Jamie ladled out a bowl, sat across from Tommy at the table. The boy watched him with that particular intensity children develop when they are trying to understand the adult world. "Where did you go?" Tommy asked finally. "Helped someone." "Who?" "A lady. She needed help burying her baby." Tommy was quiet, processing this. Then, "That's sad." "Yes." "Is she gonna be okay?" Jamie looked at his nephew, at the boy who had lost his own parents 2 years ago to the same influenza that had taken Jamie's mother. Tommy knew about death, knew about grief, knew about the particular loneliness of being left behind. "I don't know," Jamie said honestly. "I hope so." "Are you going to help her more?" The question was simple. The answer was not. Jamie thought about Grace's face, gray with exhaustion and cold. Thought about her hands trembling as they released the shovel. Thought about that small coffin and the loan payment due in 7 weeks, and Breckenridge's calculated cruelty in bringing it up mere minutes after a burial. He thought about 16 years of emotional ice of safety purchased at the cost of everything that made life worth living. "Yes," he said. "I'm going to help her." Tommy nodded, satisfied, and returned to his arithmetic. Jamie finished his stew without tasting it, staring at the table's worn surface planning. Tomorrow he would load a wagon, firewood, supplies, whatever he could spare. He would ride to her homestead and offer help, and she would probably refuse because people like her, people like him, people who had survived too much, always refused at first. But he would persist, because someone had to, because leaving her alone felt like a betrayal of something he could not quite name, but recognized nonetheless. Because maybe, just maybe, helping her would begin to thaw the ice that had kept him frozen for so long. Outside, the temperature continued to drop. The wind began to howl. And in a small cabin 2 miles to the southeast, a widow sat alone by a dying fire, trying to find the strength to face another day without the child she had loved more than life itself. The night stretched long and dark between them. But morning was coming, as it always did, with all the promise and threat that implied. Jamie woke at 4 in the morning, as he had every morning for the past 20 years. The habit was military forged during the war, when dawn meant survival or death depending on how quickly you could move. Now it simply meant he had extra hours to work before the sun rose. But this morning was different. This morning he had barely slept at all. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Grace Ashford kneeling beside that small coffin, saw her hands trembling as she released the shovel, saw Breckenridge sitting on his horse like a vulture already calculating profit from her grief. $180 due in 7 weeks. Jamie knew what that meant. Grace was a homesteader on 160 acres of marginal land. Her husband had been dead 14 months. She had just lost her only child. The odds of her having $180 saved were approximately 0, which meant Breckenridge would foreclose, would take her land for pennies on the dollar, would add it to his growing collection of properties acquired through legal theft. Jamie had seen it happen to others. Good people, hard workers crushed by circumstances and debt, and men like Breckenridge who understood that the law could be a weapon if you knew how to wield it. He dressed in the dark, moved quietly so as not to wake Tommy. Downstairs he built up the fire in the stove, put coffee on to boil, started making breakfast. Oatmeal, simple and filling. The same thing they ate most mornings. When Tommy came down half an hour later, rubbing sleep from his eyes, Jamie had the table set and food waiting. "You made breakfast," Tommy said, surprised. Usually the boy had to fend for himself until Sam or Bill wandered over from the bunkhouse. "Seemed like a good morning for it." They ate in silence for a few minutes. Tommy was not much of a talker, especially first thing in the morning. The boy had learned early that silence was safer than questions, that adults often did not want to be bothered with the concerns of children. But this morning, Tommy broke his own pattern. "Uncle Jamie," he said, looking up from his oatmeal, "where did you go yesterday?" "Helped someone." "Who?" "A lady. She needed help burying her baby." Tommy's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. His face, already too serious for 7 years, became even more so. "That's sad," he said finally. "Yes." "Is she gonna be okay?" The question was simple. The answer was anything but. Jamie looked at his nephew, at the dark hair that matched his own, at the gray eyes that held too much understanding of loss for someone so young. Tommy's parents had died 2 years ago. His father, Jamie's cousin, and his mother both taken by influenza in the same week. Jamie had ridden 3 days to collect the boy, had brought him back to the ranch, had done his best to provide food and shelter and some semblance of stability. But he knew he was failing in important ways. Tommy needed more than just food and shelter. Needed softness, gentleness, the kind of emotional nurture that Jamie had forgotten how to provide if he had ever known in the first place. "I don't know, Tommy," Jamie said honestly. "I hope so." "Are you going to help her more?" There it was, the question that had kept him awake most of the night. Was he going to help? And if so, why? What did he owe to a woman he barely knew? But even as he formed the question, he knew the answer. He owed her nothing, but he owed himself something. Owed himself the chance to be the kind of man who did not look away when someone needed help. The kind of man he had been trying to become ever since the war taught him what happened when good men stayed silent. "Yes," Jamie said, "I'm going to help her." Tommy nodded, satisfied with this answer in a way that suggested he had known it already, had just needed the confirmation. He returned to his oatmeal. After breakfast, Jamie went to the barn and began loading a wagon. He worked systematically, thinking through what Grace would need most. Firewood first. He had plenty cut and split and dried. He loaded enough to keep her warm for 2 weeks at least. Food supplies from the ranch stores. Flour coffee, dried beans, salt pork. A dressed rabbit he had shot the previous evening before riding to the cemetery. Tools. He noticed her barn door hanging crooked, the broken hinge. He found spare hardware in his workshop. By the time the sun came up, the wagon was full. Sam appeared from the bunkhouse, took one look at the loaded wagon, and nodded his understanding. "The widow?" he asked. "Yeah." "Good man, boss." Sam's voice held approval. "She's gonna need more than words." Bill emerged a moment later, moving slowly in the cold. At 64, his joints complained about winter mornings, but his mind was sharp as ever. "Her husband Robert was a good man," Bill said, watching Jamie secure the load. "Died too young. She's been alone too long." Jamie swung up onto the wagon seat, took the reins. Sam and Bill would handle the morning work. They knew the routine as well as he did. The ride to Grace's homestead took 40 minutes. Jamie used the time to plan what he would say, how he would approach this. You could not just show up with charity and expect people to accept it. Not people like Grace, who clearly valued their independence above comfort. He would have to be careful, strategic, offer help in a way that preserved her dignity. Her cabin came into view over the last rise. In daylight it looked even smaller than it had seemed the previous evening. One room maybe 16 by 20 feet. Loft above for sleeping. Barn to the side, modest and weathered. Smoke rose from the chimney. She was awake at least. Alive and functional, which was more than some people managed in the immediate aftermath of burying a child. Jamie drove the wagon into the yard and climbed down. A moment later, Grace emerged from the cabin. She looked worse than she had yesterday, if that was possible. Her face was drawn, her eyes hollow. She wore the same black dress, still damp at the hem from kneeling in snow. She had not bothered to change, or perhaps she had nothing else to wear. "Mr. Crawford," she said. Her voice was flat, empty of inflection. "Ma'am, brought firewood. Thought you might be running low." Her jaw tightened slightly. "I have enough." "Then you'll have more." Jamie began unloading without waiting for permission. This was one of the things he had learned in the war. Do not ask for permission to do the right thing. Just do it. Most people were too polite or too tired to actually stop you. He carried the first load of wood to the side of her cabin, began stacking it against the wall, neat and orderly the way his father had taught him. Grace stood watching for perhaps 30 seconds. Then, as he had hoped, practical necessity overcame pride. She came to help. They worked in silence, carrying wood from wagon to wall, building a stack that would last her well into March. The physical labor was good, warming them both despite the cold. And it meant they did not have to talk, did not have to navigate the awkward terrain of gratitude and obligation. When the wood was stacked, Jamie walked to her barn. The door hung at an angle, one hinge completely broken, the other bent. It would need to be replaced entirely. "Your door's hanging crooked," he observed. "Hinge broke. I've been meaning to fix it." "I'll do it now if you've got spare hardware." Grace hesitated, then showed him where Robert's tools were kept. A small workshop area at the back of the barn, surprisingly well organized. Robert Ashford might have died young, but he had been a man who took care of his equipment. Jamie found what he needed and set to work, removing the broken hinge, fitting the new one, adjusting until the door swung smoothly. The work took maybe 20 minutes. Grace watched from nearby, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. "Thank you," she said when he finished. The words sounded rusty, as if she had not used them in a while. "Coffee?" Jamie asked. "If you have it." She nodded and led him to the cabin. Inside, the space was clean but sparse. A bed in one corner, Emma's empty cradle beside it, Grace clearly unable or unwilling to put it away. A table with 2 chairs, a cook stove, a few shelves with dishes and supplies. A violin hanging on the wall, the only decoration in the entire room. Grace poured coffee from a pot on the stove. They sat at the table, the same table where she had sat alone the night before. Jamie waited, letting the silence settle. Then carefully he began. "That banker yesterday," he said. "Breckenridge. $180 by March 1st. You got a plan?" Her face hardened immediately. "That's not your concern, Mr. Crawford." "Maybe not, but I'm asking anyway." She looked at him for a long moment as if trying to decide whether to be angry or simply too tired to bother. Finally, she sighed. "My husband borrowed $300 last spring," she said, "for seed and cattle. He planned to pay it back from the harvest, but he died before harvest came. I sold everything I could, paid back $120. I'm left with $180, due in 7 weeks. What happens if you can't pay? Breckenridge forecloses. I lose the land, 160 acres that Robert died for." Her voice was matter of fact, but Jamie heard the despair underneath. This land was all she had left, her home, her livelihood, her last connection to the husband and child she had lost. "I can lend you the money," Jamie said slowly. Her eyes flashed the first real emotion he had seen since arriving. "I don't take charity, Mr. Crawford." "Not charity, a loan. You pay it back when you're able." "I can't accept." "Why not?" "Because—" She stopped, struggling for words. "Because I won't be indebted to another man. I've spent my whole life being dependent. On my father, on Robert. I won't do that again. I can't." Jamie felt a flicker of respect. She had pride, backbone, a refusal to play the victim even when victimhood would be easier. He understood that. After the war, when he came home broken and haunted, people had offered him pity. He had rejected it violently, had insisted on earning his way, on proving that he was still a man capable of standing on his own. "I understand," he said, "but there's another way." Grace looked at him with suspicion. "What way?" "Work for it. My ranch needs help. Spring calving's coming. I need someone who can cook for the hands, help with bookkeeping, mend gear. It's honest work, honest pay." "Why would you offer this?" "Because you need it, and I need the help. Tommy, my nephew, he's 7, needs a woman's influence. Sam and Bill try their best, but—" Jamie shrugged. "How much?" $30 a month plus meals. Room if you want it, or you can stay here and ride over daily." He watched her calculate. $30 a month times 6 months equaled $180, exactly what she needed. Too convenient to be coincidence. "This isn't charity," she asked. "This is work, hard work. You'll earn every penny." She looked at him for a long time, searching his face for dishonesty or pity or whatever it was she feared finding. Whatever she saw there, it seemed to satisfy something. "When do I start?" she asked. "Whenever you're ready." 3 days later, Grace rode to Crawford Ranch for the first time. She had spent those 3 days preparing, washing clothes, organizing what little she owned, trying to convince herself this was a sensible decision and not a mistake that would cost her in ways she could not yet predict. The ranch was larger than she had expected. The main house was solid timber construction, 2 stories with a wide porch and real glass in the windows. The barn could hold 30 horses easily. There were corrals, a bunkhouse, sheds, and equipment that spoke of generations of accumulated prosperity. Grace felt suddenly acutely aware of how shabby she must look. Her black dress was old, patched in places. Her horse was serviceable, but nothing special. She was a poor widow coming to work for wages, and everyone would know it. But she was here, and she had given her word, and Grace Ashford did not break promises. Jamie was in one of the corrals working with a young horse, teaching it to accept a saddle, moving with the patient persistence of someone who understood that rushing only made things take longer. He saw Grace and walked over. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, "glad you came." "I said I would." He led her toward the main house. Up close it was even more impressive. Solid construction, well maintained, the kind of home that took decades to build. Inside, the space was clean but clearly lacking a woman's touch. Functional furniture, no decoration, everything arranged for efficiency rather than comfort. This was a house where men lived, where work got done, where sentiment had no place. A small voice came from the kitchen area. "Uncle Jamie." Grace turned and saw the boy. Tommy Crawford, 7 years old, dark hair like his uncle's eyes that were far too serious. He stood in the doorway watching her with the careful wariness of a child who had learned not to trust easily. Jamie made introductions. "Tommy, this is Mrs. Ashford. She's going to help around here." Tommy said nothing, just looked at Grace with an intensity that was almost unsettling. Grace knelt down to be at eye level with him. This was important. Children could sense condescension, could tell when adults were performing kindness rather than feeling it. "Hello, Tommy," she said. "You can call me Miss Grace if you like." Tommy stared at her. Then, with the brutal honesty of children, he asked, "Did your baby die?" Grace heard Jamie inhale sharply, preparing to scold, but she raised a hand, stopping him. "Yes," she said to Tommy, her voice steady. "Her name was Emma. She was very sick." "That's sad." Tommy said, his tone matter-of-fact. "My mama and papa died too. From the sickness. Uncle Jamie takes care of me now." Something in Grace's chest cracked open. This boy understood. He knew what it meant to lose, to grieve, to keep going when going seemed impossible. "Then we're both lucky to have him," she said. Tommy considered this with the same serious concentration he seemed to give everything. Then he nodded, satisfied. Jamie showed Grace around. The kitchen with its large stove and ample supplies. The pantry stocked with basics, but clearly managed by men who viewed food as fuel rather than pleasure. The office where ranch records were kept, ledgers stacked in what appeared to be random order. "Sam and Bill come in for noon meal and supper," Jamie explained. "Breakfast they manage themselves, mostly. What do they usually eat? Beans, bacon, biscuits when Bill tries to make them. Results vary." Grace looked at the kitchen with a critical eye. She could work with this, would work with this. This was honest employment, the first she had ever had outside her own home, and she would prove herself worthy of it. She started immediately. Took inventory of the pantry, began planning meals for the week, found flour and started making bread dough, kneading it with the rhythm her mother had taught her 20 years ago. By noon, when Sam and Bill came in for their meal, she had stew simmering and fresh bread cooling on the counter. The two men stopped in the doorway, clearly surprised to find a woman in the kitchen. "Boss didn't tell us we had a lady cooking," Sam said, looking at Jamie with something like amusement. "Didn't want you cleaning up just for show," Jamie replied. Bill sniffed the air appreciatively. "That smells like real bread." "It is real bread," Grace said. "Sit down, please." They sat. Grace served the stew, sliced the bread, poured coffee. The three men ate in respectful silence, the kind of quiet that spoke of hunger, being satisfied by food that was more than merely edible. Bill was the first to speak. "Ma'am, this is the best meal I've had in 10 years. No disrespect to anyone's cooking, but facts are facts." Sam nodded agreement. "You can cook like this every day." "If you keep me supplied, yes." After the meal, as Grace was washing dishes, she heard the sound of a horse approaching. Through the window she saw a rider enter the ranch yard. The man was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes with a gun belt low on his hip. His face was hard-marked with scars that spoke of violence, both given and received. He sat his horse with the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to intimidating others. Jamie stepped out onto the porch. Sam and Bill followed, their hands drifting toward their own weapons with the unconscious readiness of men who had been in dangerous situations before. "Crawford," the stranger said. His voice was flat, emotionless. "Name's Jack Malone. Mr. Breckenridge sent me." "What about—" Jamie's voice had gone cold. "About Mrs. Ashford. Heard she's working here now." "That's her business. Mr. Breckenridge thinks it's interesting. Widow woman working for a bachelor rancher. People might talk." Jamie descended the porch steps, moving with deliberate calm. "People can talk all they want. Mrs. Ashford's doing honest work for honest pay. You got a problem with that?" Malone smiled, a thin expression with no humor in it. "No problem, just delivering a message. Mr. Breckenridge likes to know what's happening in his county." "This isn't his county," Jamie said. "Now get off my land." The two men stared at each other, and Grace could feel the tension even through the window. This was not mere disagreement. This was something deeper, more dangerous. Finally, Malone touched his hat brim in mock courtesy and turned his horse away. But as he rode off, he looked back once, and his eyes found Grace in the window. The message was clear. Breckenridge was watching, and whatever game he was playing, it was far from over. When Jamie came back inside, Grace was still at the window, her hands gripping the edge of the sink. "What was that about?" she asked. "Breckenridge keeping tabs. Don't worry about it." But Grace was worried. She understood what men like Breckenridge wanted: power, control, land. And she understood that by coming to work here, she had made herself part of something larger than just paying off a loan. "He wants my land," she said. Jamie did not deny it. "Probably, but he's not getting it." "How can you be sure to?" "Because I won't let him." The certainty in his voice was both reassuring and frightening. Grace barely knew this man, had no reason to trust that he would keep his word. But something in his eyes and the way he stood suggested that James Crawford did not make promises lightly. That evening, after Sam and Bill had returned to the bunkhouse and Jamie was outside checking on the horses, Tommy approached Grace in the kitchen. She was washing the supper dishes, her hands moving automatically through work that had been part of her daily routine for as long as she could remember. "Miss Grace." Tommy's voice was small. She looked down at him. "Yes." "Will you stay, or will you leave like everyone else?" The question hit her harder than she expected. This boy had lost too much: his parents, his home, his sense of security, and now he was asking her, a stranger, for something she was not sure she could give. She dried her hands and knelt down to his level, looked him in the eyes. "I'll stay as long as I'm needed, Tommy. Promise." She hesitated, did not want to make a promise she might not be able to keep, but looking at his face, at the desperate hope there, she could not refuse. "I promise to try my best." Tommy thought about this, then nodded. "Okay." As he ran outside to find his uncle, Grace stood slowly, her knees protesting. She looked around the kitchen at the clean dishes drying, at the bread she had baked, at the floor she had swept. This was honest work. This was earning her way. And maybe, just maybe, it was also the beginning of something else. Something she was not ready to name, but could feel nonetheless growing in the spaces between words and glances. Jamie appeared in the doorway. He had been standing there, she realized, had heard her exchange with Tommy. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for being honest with him. I won't lie to a child, Mr. Crawford. They've been lied to enough." "Jamie," he said. "You should call me Jamie." "Only if you call me Grace." He nodded. "Grace it is." They stood there, neither moving, both aware that something had shifted between them. Some boundary had been crossed, some new understanding reached. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of orange and pink. The temperature was dropping again, the way it always did in Wyoming winters, brutal and unforgiving. But inside the ranch house, there was warmth and light. And for the first time in longer than Grace could remember, there was the faint possibility of something that might eventually become hope. She thought about Emma, buried under frozen ground 2 miles away. Thought about Robert, gone for 14 months. Thought about all the loss that had brought her to this moment, standing in a stranger's kitchen, making promises she was not sure she could keep. But she also thought about Tommy's face when she agreed to stay. Thought about the way Jamie had defended her to Malone without hesitation. Thought about honest work and earned wages and the dignity of standing on her own feet. Maybe survival was not the same as living. Maybe there was a difference between enduring and actually being alive. Grace was not sure yet which one she was doing, but for the first time in months, she thought maybe possibly she might find out. The night settled over the ranch, bringing stars and cold and the distant howl of coyotes. Inside the house, lamps were lit, fires burned in stoves, and 3 people who had been strangers less than a week ago sat together in a warmth that was more than merely physical. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Breckenridge would not give up easily. The loan deadline was still approaching. Winter was far from over. But tonight there was bread cooling on the counter and coffee in the pot and the sound of a child's laughter as Tommy showed Grace his schoolwork. Tonight, that was enough. The first week at Crawford Ranch passed in a blur of work and routine. Grace rose before dawn, rode the 2 miles from her cabin to the ranch, and spent her days cooking, cleaning, organizing the chaos that 3 men living alone had created over the years. The ledgers were a disaster: entries crossed out and rewritten numbers that refused to balance. But Grace had patience and a head for figures that her father had cultivated when she was young. By the end of week 1, the books were in order. The kitchen ran smoothly. Tommy was eating better than he had in months, and Grace had begun to feel something she had not felt since Robert died. Useful, necessary, alive in a way that went beyond merely surviving. But the work was not without its challenges. Sam Porter watched her with quiet skepticism those first few days, not hostile exactly, but wary in the way men often were around women who claimed competence in areas traditionally reserved for men. On the 3rd day, he came into the kitchen while Grace was working on the ledger's columns of numbers spread across the table. "You really know how to do that?" he asked, nodding at the books. Grace looked up. "I do." "Most women don't. Most women aren't given the chance to learn. I was lucky. My father believed education mattered even for daughters." Sam studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Fair enough. What's the verdict?" "The verdict is that your bookkeeping has been terrible, but it's fixable. Give me another day, and I'll have everything balanced and organized. Crawford's been trying to sort those books for 2 years. "Crawford," Grace said with the faintest smile, "doesn't have my patience." Sam actually laughed at that, a short bark of sound. "No, ma'am, he surely doesn't." After that, Sam's skepticism faded. He began treating Grace with the same matter-of-fact respect he showed Jamie and Bill, which was perhaps the highest compliment he could give. Tommy was a different challenge altogether. The boy was polite always, but distant. He ate the meals Grace prepared, answered when spoken to, but otherwise kept to himself. He would disappear after breakfast, spending hours outside doing whatever 7-year-old boys did when left to their own devices. Grace understood. Tommy had lost too much too young. Every new person in his life was a potential source of pain, another attachment that might be ripped away. Better to keep everyone at arm's length than risk caring and losing again. But Grace was patient, and she recognized in Tommy something of herself, that particular kind of loneliness that came from being surrounded by people who were kind but could not truly understand. Late one afternoon, she found him sitting alone by the corral fence, watching the horses with an expression of such profound sadness that it broke her heart. She approached slowly, giving him time to notice her to run if he chose to. "Mind if I sit?" she asked. Tommy shrugged, which she took as permission. They sat in silence for several minutes. Grace had learned in her own grief that sometimes silence was better than empty words. "When Emma died," Grace said finally, "I was so angry, at God, at the world, at myself for not being able to save her." Tommy looked at her, actually looked for the first time since they had met. "I still am sometimes," Grace continued, "but I'm learning that it's okay to be angry, and it's okay to be sad, and it's okay to miss people who are gone. I miss my mama," Tommy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know you do. Uncle Jamie's good to me, but he's not her. No one can replace your mama, Tommy, but that doesn't mean you can't love other people too. Love isn't a finite thing. It doesn't run out just because you've given some away." Tommy was quiet, processing this. Then he leaned against Grace just slightly, and she put her arm around his shoulders. They sat that way until the sun began to set, and Jamie called them in for supper. The town visit came at the end of the first week. Jamie needed supplies, and Grace needed to pick up a few things for herself. Tommy begged to come along, and Jamie agreed. The ride into town took an hour. It was a Saturday, which meant Main Street was busy with ranchers and homesteaders coming in for their weekly shopping. The general store would be crowded, the saloon already doing brisk business despite the early hour. Jamie tied his horse outside the store and helped Tommy down from the wagon. Grace dismounted on her own, smoothing her dress self-consciously. She had washed it as best she could, but the black fabric was faded and worn, and she knew she looked exactly like what she was, a poor widow working for wages. Inside the store, conversation stuttered and stopped. Eyes turned toward them. Grace felt the weight of those gazes, the calculation happening behind them. James Crawford, one of the most eligible bachelors in the territory. Grace Ashford, the widow who had just buried her infant daughter, working together at his ranch. The implications were obvious, even if they were also entirely wrong. Mrs. Patricia Brennan stood at the counter talking with the shopkeeper's wife. She was a handsome woman in her mid-40s, well-dressed with the particular air of someone who believed her opinions mattered more than those of others. She was also Nathaniel Breckenridge's sister, which meant she carried her brother's influence like a weapon. "Mrs. Ashford," she said, her voice carrying across the store. "Mr. Crawford, how cozy this arrangement must be." Grace felt her spine straighten automatically. "It's an employment arrangement, Mrs. Brennan. Honest work for honest pay." "Of course, dear. Though one does wonder about appearances. A woman alone with 3 men, no proper chaperone. Some might question the propriety." Jamie stepped forward, his voice going cold in a way that Grace had not heard before. "Wondering is free, Mrs. Brennan, but spreading malicious gossip might cost you. I'd think carefully about what you say next." The shopkeeper looked nervous. "Now, Mr. Crawford, there's no need for—" "There's every need," Jamie interrupted. "Mrs. Ashford works for me. She does honest work and earns honest wages. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly. And I promise you I'm not as patient as she is." The store had gone completely silent, everyone watching, waiting to see how this would play out. Mrs. Brennan's face flushed, but she held her ground. "I'm simply concerned for Mrs. Ashford's reputation, as one woman to another." "My reputation," Grace said quietly, "has never been yours to protect, Mrs. Brennan, and I'll thank you to keep your concerns to yourself." She turned and walked to the shelves, began selecting the items she needed. Her hands were shaking, but she kept her face composed, refused to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. Jamie gathered his own supplies, paid for everything, including Grace's purchases, before she could object, and they left. Outside, as they loaded the wagon, Grace's composure finally cracked. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did. But now people will talk even more." "Let them talk. I don't give a damn what Patricia Brennan or anyone else thinks. You're working for me. That means I stand by you." Grace looked at him. Really looked. Saw something in his face that she had not seen before, a kind of fierce protectiveness that went beyond mere employment. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you care what they say?" Jamie was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because I know what it's like to be judged by people who don't know you. After the war, after Catherine died, people talked. Said I should have protected her better, should have been more careful, like they had any idea what happened, like they had any right to judge." It was the first time he had really spoken about Catherine. Grace felt the weight of that confidence, the trust implied in sharing it. "What happened to her?" Grace asked gently. "She died giving birth, along with our son, 16 years ago." His voice was flat, controlled. "The labor was difficult. Went on for 2 days. When it was over, they were both gone." "I'm sorry." "So am I." They stood there in the street, neither moving, and something passed between them. A recognition. They were both survivors of losses that had fundamentally changed them. Both people trying to figure out how to keep living when the people they had built their lives around were gone. The moment stretched. Then Tommy called from the wagon, breaking the spell. They rode back to the ranch in comfortable silence, the kind that did not need filling with words. That night after supper was cleared and Tommy had gone to bed, Grace stayed to finish some mending. Jamie sat at the table with her, ostensibly looking over some ranch papers, but Grace noticed he was not really reading them. Finally he spoke. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you say yes to working here? You could have asked others for help. Could have gone back east to family." Grace set down her needle and thread. "I have no family back east. My parents died when I was 19. Robert's family never approved of our marriage. When he died, they made it clear I was on my own. I'm sorry." "Don't be. I've learned to stand on my own feet. And when you offered me work instead of charity, you gave me something no one else had, a way to earn my keep, to maintain my dignity." Jamie nodded slowly. "That matters to you, more than anything." They were quiet for a moment. Then Grace asked, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "The war. You don't talk about it much, but Tommy mentioned nightmares. Jamie looked surprised. "He told you that?" "Not directly. He mentioned hearing you walk around at night. I've heard it too some nights when I stay late." Jamie rubbed his face. "I didn't realize anyone noticed." "You don't have to apologize for nightmares, Jamie. We all have them. Mine are just about different things." "What do you dream about?" "Emma, Robert's accident, being alone." Grace hesitated, then continued. "Sometimes I dream I'm calling for help and no one comes. I'm screaming and screaming, but no sound comes out." "That's the war," Jamie said quietly. "Every night, same dream. We're pinned down, taking fire. Men dying all around me. I try to give orders, try to save them, but I can't move, can't speak. Just watch them die." The confession hung in the air between them. "Does it get better?" Grace asked. "I don't know. It's been 16 years. I've learned to live with it." "That's not the same as getting better." "No, it's not." Grace reached across the table and took his hand. It was a bold gesture, improper by any standard. But in that moment, propriety seemed less important than connection. Jamie looked down at their joined hands, then back at her face. "Grace," he started, but whatever he was going to say was interrupted by a loud knock at the door. Jamie stood his hand going automatically to the gun he wore even at home. Grace had noticed he was never unarmed, even inside his own house. Another remnant of the war, perhaps. He opened the door to find Dr. Morrison standing there out of breath from riding hard. "Jamie," the doctor said, "I need to talk to you. And Mrs. Ashford. It's urgent." They sat at the table and Dr. Morrison laid out what he had learned. Breckenridge has been buying up debts all over the county, foreclosing on homesteaders who can't pay. In the past year alone, he's acquired 10 properties. "Why?" Grace asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. "The railroad. Wyoming and Pacific is coming through this valley next year. Anyone who owns land along the route will make a fortune selling right-of-way. We're talking about prices 100 times what the land is worth now." Jamie leaned forward. "So Breckenridge is stealing land legally, buying debts, forcing foreclosures, planning to resell to the railroad." "Exactly." Grace felt cold. "My land. Is it in the path?" Dr. Morrison pulled out a map, spread it on the table. "Right in the middle of the proposed route. Your 160 acres could be worth $50,000 to the railroad, maybe more." Jamie studied the map. His own ranch bordered Grace's property. If the route went through her land, it would come close to his as well. "How many people know about this?" Jamie asked. "Very few. Breckenridge has kept it quiet. The railroad won't announce the route officially until spring. By then he plans to own most of the land." "Can we stop him?" Grace asked. "Only if people can pay their debts and hold on to their land, but most can't afford to. We're talking about thousands of dollars total." Jamie's jaw tightened. "How much debt is out there if we wanted to save everyone?" "Rough estimate, $2,000, maybe more." The number hung in the air. It was far more than Jamie had in savings, more than he could raise without selling off significant parts of his ranch. "There's something else," Dr. Morrison said. "Breckenridge is getting impatient. He's hired men, rough men. If people won't sell willingly, I think he's prepared to make them want to leave." "You mean violence," Jamie said. "I mean, whatever it takes." After Dr. Morrison left, Grace and Jamie sat in silence. "This is bigger than my $180, Grace said finally. "Yeah. What do we do?" "I don't know yet, but we'll figure it out. Together." Grace looked at him. "Together. You're part of this now, whether you like it or not. Breckenridge wants your land. That makes this your fight as much as mine." The word "together" echoed in Grace's mind long after she rode home that night. It suggested partnership, equality, something she had never really had even in her marriage to Robert, kind as he had been. The blizzard struck without warning on a gray February morning. Grace had ridden to the ranch as usual, but by noon the wind had picked up, temperature plummeting. Jamie looked out the window at the darkening sky. "Storm's coming. Bad one. You should stay here tonight." Grace hesitated. "I need to check on my cattle." "I'll go with you. We'll make it quick." They rode together toward her homestead, But the storm hit faster than expected. Within minutes, visibility dropped to nothing. Snow drove horizontal, stinging their faces. "We need shelter," Jamie shouted over the wind. Grace pointed toward a ravine. There. They dismounted, leading the horses into the shallow protection. But as Grace stepped down, her boot caught on ice-covered rock. She fell hard, striking her head on stone. Jamie saw blood immediately dark against snow. "Grace!" He caught her as she slumped. "Grace, stay with me." Her eyes fluttered. "I'm fine. You're bleeding. We need to get you warm." He lifted her onto his horse, mounted behind her, holding her against his chest. The ride back to her cabin took 30 minutes that felt like hours. Inside, he laid her on the bed, examined the wound. Deep cut above her temple, already swelling. He cleaned it, bandaged it, his hands shaking. "Don't leave me," he whispered, not realizing he'd said it aloud. "Please don't leave me." Grace's eyes opened. "Jamie, you scared me. God, you scared me." "I'm okay, just clumsy. You're not leaving this bed until morning. I'm staying here, no arguments." That night, trapped by the storm, Jamie sat beside her bed. And he realized he loved her. Completely. Terrifyingly. The ice around his heart had finally fully thawed. The weeks that followed fell into a pattern. Grace worked at the ranch 5 days a week, handling the cooking and bookkeeping with increasing confidence. Tommy continued to open up to her slowly but surely. They began reading together in the evenings, Grace teaching him from the few books Jamie owned. Jamie watched these sessions from across the room, pretending to work, but actually just listening to Grace's voice as she read aloud. There was something soothing about it, something that quieted the constant vigilance that had defined his life since the war. But underneath the growing domesticity, tension built. Breckenridge's men were seen around town more frequently. Jack Malone and others like him, professional intimidators who made their living from other people's fear. Small incidents began to occur. A homesteader's well poisoned, a barn fire that destroyed a season's worth of hay, cattle run off in the night. Nothing that could be proved, but the pattern was clear. Breckenridge was tightening the noose. The confrontation came in mid-February on a bitter cold morning 3 weeks before Grace's loan came due. Grace woke to the smell of smoke. Not the normal smell of her own stove, but something stronger, more acrid. She ran to the window and saw flames. Her barn was on fire. She threw on clothes and ran outside, but it was already too late. The entire structure was engulfed, the heat so intense she could not get close. Her cattle were screaming inside, the sound horrific. Grace ran around to the back, managed to open a small door there. 3 cows ran out terrified, but 2 more died in the flames, their cries cutting off abruptly. By the time the fire burned itself out, nothing remained but smoking ruins. Grace stood in the snow, shaking from cold and shock, staring at the destruction. Her barn, her tools, her winter hay stores, all gone. And then she saw it. A tin of kerosene deliberately placed near where the fire had started. This was not an accident. She was still standing there when Jamie arrived an hour later, having seen the smoke from his ranch. He took one look at the scene and understood immediately. "Breckenridge," he said. "I can't prove it. We both know it." They rode to town together, reported the incident to Sheriff Polk. The sheriff barely looked up from his desk. "Fire. These things happen in winter," he said. "This was arson," Jamie insisted. "Deliberate. You got proof. There's a kerosene tin. Could have been there for months. Without witnesses or concrete evidence, I can't do anything." Grace leaned forward. "Sheriff, someone burned my barn, killed my cattle. Are you really telling me there's nothing you can do?" "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am, but the law requires evidence." Jamie's hands clenched into fists. "You won't investigate because Breckenridge owns you. How much did he pay for your loyalty?" Polk stood. "Get out, both of you, before I arrest you for disturbing the peace." Outside the sheriff's office, Grace felt the full weight of her situation crash down on her. "I can't rebuild," she said. "The barn alone would cost $80. 2 replacement cows, 40 more. New hay stores, 20. I sold my harvest and paid back $120 immediately. But that used up everything. Winter expenses since then have eaten through what little I had left. Now I have $47 total. Not enough to rebuild, not enough to pay the loan. After this, I don't even have that. How much do you need total for the loan? $180. But with the fire damages, I'd need over $300 just to get back to where I was. Jamie was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I'll cover it. No. Grace, I won't let you pay my debts. That's exactly what Breckenridge wants, for me to be dependent on you. Then he can claim impropriety and validate our arrangement, say I was never legitimately employed. She was right, and Jamie knew it. Breckenridge would twist any financial help into something sordid. Then what do? He asked. Grace's voice was hollow. I sell. Take whatever offer Breckenridge makes. Use it to pay the loan and have enough left to start somewhere else. No, we fight. How I have 3 weeks. No money, no barn, no way forward. Before Jamie could answer, Tommy's voice called from down the street. Uncle Jamie, Miss Grace men are coming. They turned to see 5 riders approaching. Nathaniel Breckenridge in the lead, Jack Malone beside him, 3 other hard-looking men behind. They stopped in front of the sheriff's office. Breckenridge dismounted with the casual confidence of a man who owned the town. Crawford, Mrs. Ashford, I heard about the unfortunate fire. My condolences. Save it, Jamie said. Your men set that fire. Careful with accusations, Crawford. Slander is actionable. Breckenridge turned to Grace. Mrs. Ashford, I have a solution to your difficulties. I'm prepared to offer $200 for your land. Cash today. That covers your loan with money left over. My land is worth $800. Only if you can keep it, which given recent events seems unlikely. Breckenridge's smile did not reach his eyes. This is a generous offer. I suggest you take it. Grace drew herself up to her full height, which was not much, but dignity had nothing to do with physical size. My answer is no. That's unfortunate. You have 3 weeks until your loan comes due. Without a barn, without income, I don't see how you'll make that payment. He nodded to Malone, who pulled out a document. Notice of debt acceleration, Malone read. Mrs. Grace Ashford, your outstanding loan is hereby called due immediately effective as of this date. Grace felt her blood run cold. You can't do that. The bank can call loans at any time if the borrower's financial condition deteriorates significantly. Your barn burning constitutes such deterioration. You have 24 hours to pay the full $180, or I foreclose tomorrow. It was a trap perfectly executed. The fire had been deliberate, designed to create the exact conditions that would allow Breckenridge to accelerate the loan. This is theft, Jamie said, his voice deadly quiet. This is business, Crawford, nothing personal. Breckenridge mounted his horse. 24 hours, Mrs. Ashford. Think carefully about your decision. They rode away, leaving Grace and Jamie standing in the street. He planned this, Grace said, her voice shaking with rage rather than fear. The fire, the acceleration, everything. He's been orchestrating this from the beginning. We need $180. Today. Where do we get it? They went to Jamie's ranch, gathered Sam Bill and Dr. Morrison, laid out the situation. I have $23 saved, Tommy said, appearing from the next room. He had been listening. My papa gave it to me before he died, said to use it for something important. The adults stared at the boy. Miss Grace is important, Tommy continued, holding out a tin box with his savings. This helps her stay right. Grace felt tears sting her eyes. She knelt down to Tommy's level. I can't take your money, sweetheart. Why not? You said love doesn't run out when you give it away. Maybe money's the same. Maybe if we all give some, there's enough. Out of the mouths of children, Sam spoke up. I've got $10. Not much, but it's yours. Bill nodded. 15 from me. Dr. Morrison pulled out his wallet. 30. Everything I can spare. Jamie did the calculation. With ranch funds, I can add 70. That gives us 148. We're still $32 short. They sat in silence, trying to think of solutions. Then Dr. Morrison spoke. There's one more option. The horses. Jamie, your breeding stock is worth serious money. One of your stallions could bring $80, maybe $100. Jamie felt something twist in his chest. Those horses were his father's legacy, 20 years of careful breeding to create animals that could survive Wyoming winters and work the roughest terrain. But Grace was looking at him with those dark eyes, and he thought about Catherine, about how he had failed to save her, about 16 years of living half a life because he was afraid to risk caring again. "Do it," he said. "Send word to Cheyenne. Tell them I have a black stallion for sale, best mountain horse in the territory. They can have him for $100 cash, but they need to be here by morning." "Jamie, no," Grace protested. "Not for me. Those horses are everything to you." Jamie took her hands. "They're horses, Grace. You're—" He stopped searching for words. "You're more important." The look that passed between them held volumes that neither was ready to speak aloud. Dr. Morrison left immediately to send the telegraph. The buyer's response came within 2 hours. They would arrive first thing in the morning with cash. That night, Grace insisted on going home to her cabin despite Jamie's protests that she should stay at the ranch where it was safer. She needed to think, needed space to process everything that was happening. But she could not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her barn burning, saw Breckenridge's cold smile, saw the impossible situation closing in around her. And she saw Jamie's face when he offered to sell his horse. The pain there carefully hidden, but visible if you knew where to look. He was sacrificing something that mattered deeply to him. For her. A woman he had known less than 2 months. Why, Grace rose before dawn and rode to Jamie's ranch, found him in the barn grooming the black stallion one last time. "I can't let you do this," she said from the doorway. Jamie did not turn around. "It's already done. The buyers will be here in an hour." "But those horses are your father's work, your legacy." "My father's been dead 5 years. He'd understand." Grace walked closer, put her hand on the horse's neck. The animal was magnificent, powerful, and elegant in equal measure. "Why are you doing this, Jamie, really? Don't tell me it's just employment. Don't tell me it's just being neighborly. Tell me the truth." Jamie finally looked at her. In the dim light of the barn, with dawn just breaking outside his face, showed every one of his 34 years and then some. "Because I spent 16 years barely living," he said. "Because I watched you bury your daughter, and something in me woke up that I thought was dead. Because Tommy smiles now when he didn't before you came. Because the house feels like a home instead of just a place to sleep." He stepped closer to her. "Because when I think about Breckenridge taking your land, forcing you to leave, I can't breathe. And I don't know what that means exactly, but I know it matters." Grace felt her heart hammering. "Jamie." But whatever she was going to say was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching. Multiple riders. They stepped out of the barn to see not the buyers from Cheyenne, but townspeople. A dozen of them led by the shopkeeper from the general store. "Mr. Crawford," the shopkeeper called. "Heard you were selling your stallion to help Mrs. Ashford. Heard about what Breckenridge is doing. We brought money." He held up a bag. $53 total. Everybody pitched in what they could. It's not much, but it's enough, Jamie said, his voice rough. More than enough. With the community's contribution, Tommy's savings, and the money from Sam Bill and Dr. Morrison, they had well over the $180 needed. The Cheyenne buyers arrived an hour later, disappointed to find the horse was no longer for sale. But Jamie sent them away with information about other horses he could sell later when the urgency had passed. By noon, they were in Breckenridge's bank. Jamie, Grace, Sam Bill, Dr. Morrison, and half the town. Grace walked to the counter and placed $180 in coins and bills in front of Breckenridge. "Payment in full," she said, "for the loan on my property." Breckenridge's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Surprise, anger, calculation. He counted the money, slowly making them wait. Finally, he looked up. "This is correct. $180. Your debt is satisfied." He wrote out a receipt, his hand stiff with barely controlled fury. Grace took it, folded it carefully, tucked it into her pocket. "We're done here," she said. But as they turned to leave, Breckenridge spoke again. "Mrs. Ashford, one more matter." They stopped. "Your property taxes, $47 owed. Payment was due yesterday. I'm afraid the county will have to seize your land for tax sale unless you can pay immediately." The silence was absolute. This was the final trap, the last piece of Breckenridge's plan. Grace felt the world tilt. She had no more money. They had used everything to pay the loan. Grace stood there defeated when she heard footsteps behind her. The shopkeeper from the general store stepped forward, his face flushed with shame. "Mrs. Ashford," he said loudly so everyone could hear, "I owe you an apology. We all do. We let Breckenridge intimidate us, let gossip poison our judgment. But watching you fight, watching Mr. Crawford and young Tommy stand by you, watching you refuse to give up even when beaten." He pulled coins from his pocket. "This town was built by people like you, people who don't quit. I've got $5 for the taxes, and I'm ashamed I didn't offer it sooner." Mrs. Brennan, standing in the crowd, looked uncomfortable, but she said nothing. The blacksmith stepped forward next. "3 from me, and my apology, ma'am." The school teacher, tears in her eyes. $2. I'm sorry we failed you when you needed us most." One by one, townspeople came forward, the same people who had gossiped about Grace weeks before. Now they pulled coins from their pockets, bills from their wallets. Within minutes they had $50. Grace took the money with shaking hands and placed it on Breckenridge's desk. $47 for the taxes. The rest is for next year, paid in advance." Breckenridge had no choice. He processed the payment, his face a mask of controlled rage. Outside the bank, the crowd erupted in cheers. People clapped Grace on the back, congratulated her, told her they were proud she had stood up to Breckenridge. The shopkeeper approached her. "We should have helped sooner, Mrs. Ashford, should have stood with you from the beginning. But we're standing now." Grace could not speak, could only nod, overwhelmed by the sudden reversal. Jamie appeared at her side, steadying her with a hand on her elbow. "You did it," he said quietly. "We did it," she corrected. "I couldn't have done this alone." They rode back to the ranch together, Sam and Bill following behind. The victory felt surreal, too good to be fully believed. But that night, as they sat at Jamie's table with Tommy asleep upstairs, the reality settled in. Grace owned her land free and clear. Breckenridge had been defeated, at least for now. "What happens next?" Grace asked. "Next we rebuild your barn. Can't have you wintering cattle without proper shelter. I can't afford. I'll cover the materials. You work it off." "Same arrangement as before." Grace shook her head. "That's not the same arrangement, Jamie. That's charity. It's investment. Your land borders mine. If the railroad comes through, we'll both be dealing with it. Makes sense to keep you there." It was logical, practical, and also not the whole truth. Grace looked at him across the table, this man who had appeared in her life at its darkest moment and refused to let her face it alone. "Jamie," she said carefully, "what are we doing here? What do you mean? This arrangement, is it still just employment?" Jamie met her eyes. "No." "Then what is it?" He reached across the table, took her hand in his. "I don't know exactly what to call it, but it's more than employment, more than friendship. It's—" He struggled for words. "It scares me," Grace admitted. "The thought of caring about someone again, of risking loss." "I know, it scares me too." "Then why do it?" "Because 16 years of being safe was also 16 years of being half dead, and I don't want to live like that anymore." Grace squeezed his hand. "I can't promise I won't die. Can't promise I won't leave. Life has taught me those promises are impossible to keep. I'm not asking for promises, just possibility." "Possibility of what?" "Of this, whatever this becomes." They sat holding hands across the table until the fire burned low and the night grew cold. And when Grace finally rode home, she carried with her the weight of something new. Not quite hope, not quite love, but the fragile beginning of both. The weeks that followed brought change, like spring brings green shoots through snow. Subtle at first, then impossible to miss. Jamie's men rebuilt Grace's barn in record time, working sunrise to sunset until it stood solid and weatherproof. The community donated lumber hardware labor. What had been destroyed by malice was restored by collective goodwill. Grace paid her way by cooking for the workers, keeping their books organized, managing supplies. Tommy helped where he could, carrying tools and fetching water, delighted to be useful. And through it all, Grace and Jamie circled each other with increasing awareness. Hands that touched longer than necessary when passing dishes. Conversations that stretched late into the evening. Glances that carried weight. One evening in late February, after a particularly difficult day where Grace had found herself crying over a dish that Emma used to like, she noticed the violin hanging on Jamie's wall. "May I?" she asked. Jamie nodded. Grace took down the instrument. Her hands trembled as she rosined the bow. She hadn't played since before Emma's birth. Music had felt impossible in grief. But tonight something shifted. She drew the bow across the strings. The first notes were uncertain, rusty. Then muscle memory took over. She played a lullaby her mother had taught her, the same one she'd sung to Emma. Tears streamed down her face as she played, but she didn't stop. Jamie watched from his chair, transfixed. This was the first time he'd seen her truly grieve, truly let herself feel. And somehow the music transformed the grief into something bearable. When she finished, silence filled the room. "That was for Emma," Grace said softly. "She would have loved it," Jamie replied. Grace smiled through her tears. It was the first real smile he'd seen since the cemetery. Tommy appeared in the doorway. "That was beautiful, Miss Grace. Will you play more?" "Yes, sweetheart. I think I will." And in that moment Jamie knew she was going to survive this. They both were. They were quiet for a moment. Then Jamie spoke. "I've been thinking. About what happens after your barn is finished, after you've worked off the debt." "What then?" Grace set down her violin carefully. "I suppose I go back to managing my own place, try to make a go of it alone." "That's one option. What's the other?" Jamie turned to face her fully. "You could stay, not as an employee, as a partner. We combine the properties, work them together, pool resources, share the work and the profits." "Jamie, I know it's irregular, but nothing about any of this has been regular. And I think—" He paused, gathering courage. "I think we work well together. I think Tommy needs you, and I think maybe I do too." Grace's heart was racing. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" "I'm asking if you'd consider marrying me. Not right away, not until you're ready. But someday, when the grief isn't quite so sharp, when the possibility of happiness doesn't feel like a betrayal." Grace looked at him, this quiet man with his scars visible and invisible, offering her something she had thought was lost forever. A future, a home, a chance at joy. "I need to show you something first," she said. They rode together through the moonlit night to the Valley Cemetery. Grace had been there only twice since Emma's burial, the pain still too raw for frequent visits. But tonight felt different. Tonight felt like transition. They stood at Emma's grave. Bill had carved the stone as promised, set it in place just days before. "Emma Rose Ashford, beloved daughter." "Emma," Grace said softly, kneeling in the snow. "This is Jamie, the man I told you about, the man who helped when no one else would." She was quiet for a moment, tears streaming down her face. "I think I'm going to marry him," she continued. "And I needed you to know. Needed to feel like I wasn't forgetting you, because I won't, sweet girl, never." Jamie knelt beside her, placed his hand on the stone. "I'll take care of your mother," he said quietly. "I promise you that. She'll always have a home warmth, everything she needs. And I'll make sure she never forgets you, that you're always part of our story." They stayed there until the cold became unbearable, then rode back to Jamie's ranch in silence. At the door, before Grace could mount her horse to ride home, Jamie took her hand. "You don't have to answer now," he said. "Take all the time you need, but know that I'm here, that I'm not going anywhere." Grace looked up at him, this good man offering her the world with no strings, no demands. "Yes," she said. Yes, yes, I'll marry you. Not today, not tomorrow, but when spring truly comes, when the prairie is green and the wildflowers bloom, I'll marry you then. Jamie pulled her into his arms, held her tight, and for the first time since Catherine's death, he felt something he had thought was gone forever. He felt whole. They were married on May 15th, when the prairie transformed into a sea of green dotted with wildflowers in every color. The morning dawned clear and warm, the first truly beautiful day after months of bitter cold. Grace woke in her cabin for the last time as a single woman. She dressed slowly, carefully in the blue calico dress she had sewn over the past 2 weeks. The fabric was simple, but the cut was elegant, fitted at the waist with long sleeves and a modest neckline. She had embroidered tiny flowers along the cuffs, working by lamplight after her chores were done. Her hands shook as she pinned up her hair. Not from fear, but from the overwhelming reality of what was happening. She was getting married. Again. After everything she had lost, she was choosing to risk her heart one more time. A knock at the door made her turn. Dr. Morrison stood there dressed in his Sunday best. "Thought you might need someone to escort you to the ranch," he said kindly. "Every bride deserves someone to walk her down the aisle, even if that aisle is just a path to a cottonwood tree." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you." The ride to Crawford Ranch took 20 minutes. With every passing yard, Grace felt her heart beat faster. She was nervous, yes, but beneath the nerves was something stronger. Certainty. Jamie was a good man, a kind man, and she loved him. When they arrived, she saw that Jamie and the others had transformed the area by the creek. Chairs borrowed from the church formed rows facing the cottonwood tree. Wildflowers decorated every surface, filling the air with their sweet scent. A simple arch stood beneath the tree woven with prairie roses. And there, standing beneath that arch, was Jamie. He wore a black suit that Grace had never seen before, probably saved for special occasions. His dark hair was neatly combed, his face clean-shaven. But what struck her most was his expression. Pure joy. No shadow of the pain he usually carried. Just happiness open and unguarded. Tommy stood beside him in a miniature suit, grinning widely. Sam and Bill flanked them both, looking uncomfortable in their formal clothes, but pleased nonetheless. A circuit preacher, Reverend Thomas, waited by the arch with his Bible open. Dr. Morrison offered Grace his arm. Together they walked down the makeshift aisle. The gathered friends stood ranch hands from neighboring properties, the shopkeeper and his wife, the blacksmith, the school teacher, even a few of the townspeople who had once gossiped but now came to show support. Grace's eyes stayed on Jamie, and his on her. When she reached the arch, Dr. Morrison placed her hand in Jamie's. "Take care of her," the doctor whispered. "With my life," Jamie promised. Reverend Thomas began, "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of James Crawford and Grace Ashford." Grace barely heard the opening words. She was too focused on Jamie's hand holding hers warm and steady. On the way, he looked at her like she was the answer to a prayer he'd been too afraid to speak aloud. "Marriage," the Reverend continued, "is not to be entered into lightly but reverently, deliberately, and in accordance with the purposes for which it was instituted by God." Both Jamie and Grace knew this better than most. They had both loved and lost, both buried spouses. Both understood that marriage was no guarantee against pain, but they also understood that love, however brief, was worth having. "James," Reverend Thomas said, "do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death do you part?" Jamie's voice was strong and clear. "I do." "And do you, Grace, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part?" Grace thought of Robert buried these past 18 months. Thought of Emma resting under the cottonwood in the Valley Cemetery. Thought of Catherine and the son Jamie had lost. All of them were part of this moment. All of them had brought Jamie and Grace to this place. "I do," she said firmly. Jamie reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring. His mother's ring, gold and simple, worn smooth with age. "With this ring," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "I thee wed." He slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Grace had no ring for him. Wedding bands for men were uncommon on the frontier. But she had something else. She pulled from her pocket a small piece of blue cloth, the same fabric as her dress. "I made this," she said softly, "from the same material as my wedding dress, so that you'd have a piece of this day with you always." She tied it around his wrist, knotting it carefully. A simple token, but it meant everything. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Thomas declared with a smile. "Mr. Crawford, you may kiss your bride." Jamie cupped Grace's face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears she hadn't realized were falling. He kissed her gently, tenderly, with a promise of all the days to come. The gathering erupted in applause and cheers. Tommy whooped loudly, making everyone laugh. When Jamie and Grace finally pulled apart, both were smiling through tears. "Mrs. Crawford," Jamie said softly, trying out her new name. "Mr. Crawford," she replied. And just like that, they were married. The celebration that followed was simple but joyful. Sam had barbecued a whole pig. Bill had made his terrible biscuits, which everyone ate anyway with good humor. The cake Tommy and Grace had baked together sat as the centerpiece, slightly lopsided, but covered in wild honey. People ate and talked and laughed. The sun climbed high and warm. Music played from borrowed instruments, fiddles and harmonicas, creating folk tunes that had people dancing in the grass. Grace danced with Jamie, then with Tommy, then with Dr. Morrison, then with Bill, who was surprisingly light on his feet for his age. As the sun began to set and guests started departing, each person stopped to congratulate the new couple. The shopkeeper, "May you have many happy years together." The schoolteacher, "You give us all hope, Mrs. Crawford." Even Mrs. Brennan, who had come despite herself, "I was wrong about you. I wish you well." Finally, only Jamie, Grace, and Tommy remained. They stood by the creek as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. "Are you happy, Miss Grace?" Tommy asked. "I mean Mrs. Crawford." "Happier than I've been in a very long time," Grace said honestly. "Me too," Tommy said, then ran off to chase fireflies that were just beginning to emerge. Jamie put his arm around his wife. "No regrets. None. You. Not a single one." They stood together watching the stars appear one by one, and Grace thought about the long journey that had brought her here. The pain and loss. The struggle and fear. The moment she thought she had nothing left to live for. And yet here she was, married to a good man, mother to a sweet boy who needed her, owner of land she had fought to keep, surrounded by a community that had finally learned to stand together. Life hadn't defeated her, and it wouldn't, because she had learned the most important lesson of all: surviving was not the same as living, and she was finally truly alive again. As evening fell and the last neighbors departed, Tommy approached his uncle and new aunt. "Does this mean Miss Grace is my aunt now?" he asked. "It does," Jamie confirmed. Tommy considered this. Then, with the serious expression he wore for important matters, he said, "Good. I'm glad she's staying." "Me too, son. Me too." That night in the home that was now theirs together, Grace and Jamie stood on the porch, watching the stars emerge. "Do you think we can make this work?" Grace asked. "I think we already are. Even with everything we've lost. Especially with everything we've lost. We know how precious this is, how rare. We won't take it for granted." Grace leaned against him. "I still miss her. Emma. I still ache. I know. I still miss Catherine sometimes. And our son. But the ache doesn't mean we can't also feel joy. The two exist together." "How did you get so wise?" 16 years of being stupid first. Had to learn eventually." Grace laughed, the sound bright and unexpected. Jamie realized it was the first time he had heard her really laugh full and genuine. He wanted to hear it again, wanted to spend the rest of his life finding ways to make her laugh. They stood together as darkness fell completely, and the prairie settled into night sounds. Crickets whined through grass, the distant call of a coyote answered by another far away. Inside, the lamp was lit. The fire burned warm. Tommy slept soundly in his bed, secure in the knowledge that the people he loved would be there in the morning. And Grace and Jamie, two survivors, two people scarred by loss and strengthened by it, faced the future together. Spring had come, and with it the promise that life, however hard, continues, that love, however scarred, endures, that hope, however fragile, is worth choosing again and again. The stars wheeled overhead, infinite and cold and beautiful. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, work to be done, land to manage, a life to build together. But tonight there was only this moment of peace, hard won and deeply treasured, and it was enough.